Thank you, Kathy, and it's great to be back with all of you. It's 12 noon here in New York City, and it's a beautiful, brisk morning, or afternoon, I should say. For the first time in a few days, it's starting to feel almost spring-like here. And so there's definitely a sense that the worst of that, really significant cold that a number of us were enduring over the last few weeks may be behind us. We shall see. Um, and we're glad to have so many of you from all across the state with us, as well as in the other corners where, as a firm, we're delighted to be of help and support to you. And so let me walk you through the agenda for today's program. I remind you that, because we are working with 30 minutes, as we've been doing since the beginning of this year, we will have a slightly fewer number of presenters. Three in total. I will be, after this introduction, moving into some discussion around what's been happening in New York State, both with the proposed budget and as well what we can expect legislatively and what already we have seen outside of the budget process. Because of course, the budget happens in many respects in its own space, but it is ultimately a legislative instrument. And then the legislature is passing its own set of bills, as well that the governor is considering all along the way. So that's been happening over these last few weeks as we flip the calendar to 2025. And so we haven't really caught all of you up in a while, and I intend to do that today. Then after that, two of my colleagues from our Albany office, Emily Alquist and Delaney Knapp, I have the pleasure of working with them both, are going to talk about New York's LLC Transparency Act. There's some interesting implications for not-for-profit entities and in specific, the ways not-for-profits and for-profit entities interact under the standards, which are certainly worthwhile for, I think, all of you to hear about. And we want to get into some of that in the latter half of the program. And then I'll wrap things up by 12:30. So Kathy, if you'd advance the next slide, please, I'll start with my presentation. And this is just a reminder, a level setting, as it were. All of you recall that I had presented a couple weeks ago on some of the early activity concerning the state's efforts to move to a formal budget for fiscal year 26, meaning the budget that takes us from about a chunk of the way through 25 into the first quarter of 2026. And so to frame all of that and to provide a set of policy goals, Governor Kathy Hochul delivered a State of the State address on January 14th. And in that State of the State, she highlighted public safety initiatives, as well as a variety of others, including mental health initiatives, some with some overlay around public safety in terms of the way she framed things. There were also a variety of markers that she placed, as it were, in her speech concerning consumer protection and affordability in New York State, two areas that she's seeking to emphasize through the budget instrument and otherwise. Housing is also a priority. All of you may remember over these last two budget cycles, there have been significant efforts to change the way housing is ultimately funded, particularly supportive and affordable housing. And there's been a significant amount of back and forth about that. And the governor is entering that space again, at least intends to. Maternal and infant health are also on the governor's to-do list, trying to bolster protections and programs there. And the governor is also looking at energy, which is, of course, as described, a very large, almost amorphous, term, but energy really from the perspective of conservation, as well as for other efficiencies, as well as innovations, technology, et cetera. And so there's language throughout the budget addressing, as proposed anyway, addressing a variety of these kinds of areas. So next slide, please, Kathy, and I'll move the group through. We went from what was a proposed set of themes in the State of the State to the budget that was actually issued as proposed on January 21st. This again by the governor and the executive branch. As all of you are familiar, there is a give and take around this time of year where the governor issues a proposal Ultimately, it's reviewed by lots of folks, myself included, across the state. There are 30-day amendments where the budget proposal can be adjusted. Those are shortly forthcoming. I'll get to that in a moment. There are also one House bills from the state's Assembly and Senate, and there's an effort to reconcile all of that through negotiations that by law are supposed to be wrapped up with a budget signed by April 1st. Doesn't always happen that way. We've seen the last couple of budgets, it has eked a few weeks past. We will find out what happens this time around. But as a reminder, in terms of some of the bigger themes around this budget, what we had talked about when I last presented was that there's going to be a $10 billion spending boost if this budget goes forward as proposed, which would take it up from last year's $239 billion enacted budget, which was, of course, tweaked at mid-year to account for some additional spend. And then, some of the plans that were outlined in the State of the State that made their way into the budget, included, enhanced subway security, the school cell phone ban, which I addressed in my comments a couple of weeks ago, some efforts to provide modest amounts of monies to various New Yorkers, essentially tax relief in various forms that will, in the governor's eyes, tally to meaningful money for a variety of different households. More on that as we get into the material. And so for now, Kathy, if we go to the next slide, let me leave folks with that outline. But one thing that was uncertain and is starting to come into greater focus is essentially some of the budget assumptions that every year are critical in terms of how one gets to the finalized number, as it were. And the ultimate agreement on a budget is contingent on, the sources of funding that New York State has to work with. And one of the things I had mentioned previously to all of you is this managed care organization tax. It is not quite unique. It is an unusual maneuver. California also has done it, where essentially through more or less a mapping of federal dollars, New York State can, by taxing managed care organizations in the state and then repaying them, drive through many more billions of federal dollars into New York's budget, or otherwise into its coffers for expenditures. At the very end of last year, just before the Biden administration concluded, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services approved New York's MCO tax. And so that is part of the set of assumptions built into the budget, that money, I should say, in some contingent ways, but it's being counted on. Congestion pricing is something else we've talked about, and that is also part of the mix. I mentioned something that is close to those in the healthcare and related spaces, the 1115 waiver amendment. This is about $8 billion or so of funding, depending on how you count it. That also was approved in 2024. This in January. Programs have started in 2025. There are elements of that which are baked in, as it were, into the budget proposal. And so the governor is acting on the assumption that this money, despite the change in federal administrations, will remain accessible to New York State. Today is what has been historically called Tin Cup Day. I didn't make up the term. It very much predates all of us here. But what it means is that's the day when mayors and other principals from around the municipalities in New York State come to Albany to advocate for their needs. And this is all part of the budget process. It's a ritual of sorts, but an important one for various municipalities, and that's happening. I mentioned in passing that the 30-day amendments are coming. That's a place where you don't usually see a lot of major change, although occasionally there are exceptions. Last year, there were certainly some. Those 30-day amendments are, a chance for the governor to make, broadly what are technical shifts in the budget proposal. I mentioned the one House bills are forthcoming, and then ultimately we will get to some nature of resolution around April 1st. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I mentioned congestion pricing in passing, and it's important just to double back on it because it launched in January and it remains in effect. As I was earlier walking around Manhattan before getting to my office, I was reminded by seeing a sign for new tolls as one goes south on Fifth Avenue, crossing into the 60th Street zone. That sign certainly was not there before. And I can also tell you by looking out from my office, the view is pretty much as is captured in that picture. It's really rather traffic free. And so from a place of experience, I can tell you that, it's certainly lessening the density of traffic in New York City. The bigger questions, though, of course, are, so what kind of revenue generation is it going to lead to? What kind of health relating benefits that are proposed will ultimately play out? These are at this point, unknowns, but there are lots of assumptions around them. At the same time, we know that President Trump is examining the program. President Trump indicated as such before returning to the White House in January. And what we also know is that the president is seeking to have former U.S. Rep. Mark Molinaro, who's known to many of you from the Hudson Valley, to lead the Federal Transit Administration. The FTA has control over things like congestion pricing, and Mr. Molinaro is on the record as being against it. And so we will see how this all plays out, but it's part of the budget and its assumptions. And, if that program does not proceed, it will certainly change some of the assumptions in the budget. Next slide, please. And so let's get into some of the details of the budget. One of the things that I wanted to highlight, as someone who practices a significant amount in healthcare, as you all know, is a set of provisions in healthcare that we're tracking. These are just examples of provisions because there are lots of areas that the budget touches from a place of policy and program. Healthcare, though, we know touches many of you, whether you come to us for labor support or program and operational support. So we thought it was important to highlight what's happening in the budget. And so if it goes forward as proposed, we will see Vital Access Provider Assurance Program funding again, which is basically informally thought of as emergency funding for certain healthcare providers, particularly those that are Article 28s for those who are familiar with that terminology. There'll be some drop from previous fiscal year if the governor's proposal becomes law. There are monies built into the proposal for safety net hospitals, those that are serving a high proportion of individuals who rely on Medicaid as their insurer. That's a loose proxy for thinking about what a safety net is, and a vital access provider program that has predated VAPAP, and it's been engine for program change around New York State for a while, is pegged to have about 162 million to work with going into this next fiscal if, again, everything in here is approved as currently proposed. Half of that would be federal, which is the way that program works. There's a proposal for hospital at home, which is basically bringing sophisticated care, hospital level, as it were, into homes. That is a trend around the country that we're seeing potentially being funded in part through New York State budget activity. I mentioned the MCO tax earlier, and I mentioned how it is a important contingent element in the budget. Nursing homes, for instance, would get a pretty significant bump in their reimbursement for the services they provide, but that's so long as the MCO tax holds. And so we will have to see. Other things include a pool of operators that would be expanded if the governor has an opportunity to see these proposals through to law. Concerning temporary operators. Temporary operators are folks who step in on an exigent and interim basis to lead healthcare institutions, and there's certain parameters around that the governor wants to see loosened. Next slide, please. In the behavioral health space, we're also going to see more funding. That's been an area of focus for the governor, we know, for some time. Human services organizations generally are going to see a modest COLA increase if everything goes as proposed. I'm confident that number will get negotiated and folks will be pushing for more. That's already begun, all the more, I'm sure. There are flexibilities that the governor is calling for around healthcare workforce. As we all lived through the pandemic, we saw some of the challenges that occurred with healthcare being provided by individuals who did not practice or otherwise who were not formally recognized by New York State. The governor's looking to essentially learn from some of those experiences and try to build in flexibilities. This type of initiative, it's not the first time she's proposed it. It has not gotten over the finish line previously, but the governor is trying again. There will be some emphasis on physician practice transactions, building on efforts that are in law now to provide, in the governor's view, more transparency around those transactions. There'll be activities around children and families, as I earlier noted. That remains a theme throughout the budget proposal. And for those of you in the Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse areas, if indeed this budget goes forward as proposed, there will be anti-poverty funds that will be specifically earmarked for those communities. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, in addition to the budget proposal, which will work its way through that process and we'll know more over these coming weeks, there are bills that aren't connected to the budget that are making their way through. The legislature reconvened last month. It will go all the way through June, as is its general practice. There sometimes are, extensions of that, for extraordinary circumstances, but generally January through June is the time when New York State's legislative branches, both the Assembly and the Senate, are most active. And we've seen the governor signing some bills in that context. S-735, for instance, involves funding for housing projects that are publicly funded. S-757, and for each of these, you see the Assembly parallel language. This concerns childcare block granting. There are some efforts to, in the agriculture law, acknowledge some of the changing dynamics around cannabis and to update the law there. There are provisions around milk and dairy products being allowed now for more flexible use in anti-hunger applications, programs, and the like. And on the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about something that was just earlier this week taking place. And this made national news. There was a physician from the Hudson Valley area who prescribed medication to someone in Louisiana. That medication was involved in what was an abortion. The governor has made it very clear that it is her intent to protect physicians, and other practitioners. She both said that, notwithstanding Louisiana's wish to again prosecute this individual, she's not going to permit the extradition. And further, she signed into law a tweak that essentially removes the names of physicians who are prescribing such medication, allows that to be essentially hidden when prescriptions are being sent over state lines in this context. And so that's what this bill was about. And this is going to be, I expect, an ongoing focus of the governor, as she has made it clear it is a priority for her following the Dobbs decision. Next slide, please. And so also in New York, we've seen a fair amount of activity around bills that have gotten through the Assembly and the Senate, but that at this point haven't yet gotten signed by the governor. There's some interesting rules in how we do it here in New York, and I've talked with you all about them before. But essentially, just because the bills get through both the Assembly and the House, or rather, and the Senate, forgive me, they ultimately need to be requested by the governor, and then the governor has a defined period to evaluate them. None of them on this list have gone through that process. But one involves emergency response training involving lithium-ion battery fires. Of course, we've seen an uptick on those across the country as e-bikes and other modes of transportation become more prevalent. Smoke detectors in residential buildings was another focus of bills that got through both the Assembly and the Senate. Restaurant reservations was another. We have nationally as well as in New York seen an uptick in bots and other businesses essentially hoarding restaurant reservations and then creating secondary markets for them. This is an effort to tackle that. There are efforts to, speaking of attack and tackle, look at online dating apps where fraud can be a major issue. And then what I wanted to highlight finally is the New York Health Information Privacy Act. This is actually a really interesting bill that, if it became law, would really change in lots of respects issues around healthcare data standards. I wrote a small piece about it last week that was part of our cybersecurity and data privacy practices countdown to Data Privacy Day. That link that is abbreviated at the bottom of the page takes you to the story on the right side here. And if you want to read more detail, please click through. We will be tracking this because if the governor signs it, it will be big news for data privacy in New York State. Next slide, please. So with that, we hope that that snapshot is giving you a flavor of what is to come. I'll be back with you for more updated information as we move through February, March into April. But for now, it's time to shift in our program to some other really important information. We're delighted to be able to have with us today both Emily Alquist and Delaney Knapp, who sit in our Albany office and who each are associates who work extensively in our exempt organizations practice. I've had the pleasure of working closely with both of them, and they're here to talk about New York's LLC Transparency Act and some interesting aspects and dynamics around exemptions available for subsidiaries of not-for-profits. It sounds a little technical, but I promise it is worth your time because these dynamics apply in lots of places across New York State, and we want to make sure all of you are up to date. So Delaney and Emily, we're glad to have you both, and please go ahead. I'll leave it to you to update the group. Thanks.
Thanks, Gabe. And we'll do our best to break it down so it's easy to understand. Next slide, Kathy.
The New York law, the New York LLC Transparency Act, was originally passed in December 2023. Recent amendments have, among other things, extended its effective date to January 1st, 2026. The New York law was enacted in wake of the federal counterpart, the Corporate Transparency Act, to prevent illicit and fraudulent activities perpetrated or aided by anonymously owned LLCs that are organized or authorized to do business in New York State. And as a general matter, the New York law requires LLCs to disclose certain identifying information about their beneficial owners to the Department of State unless an exemption applies. Notably, and unlike under the CTA, the federal law, exempt LLCs under the New York law have certain filing obligations, and we'll cover this in detail on a later slide. You can go to the next slide.
So the New York law has a definition of an exempt company, one that doesn't have to comply with the extensive reporting and disclosure requirements. And that definition incorporates by reference the 23 exemptions that are listed out under the federal law, the Corporate Transparency Act. One of these 23 exemptions is kind of termed the subsidiary exemption, and it's applicable to subsidiaries that are wholly owned by certain nonprofits. Now, the New York law is only applicable to limited liability companies, so it's a little bit more limited in nature and scope than the federal law. And another important distinction is that unlike the federal law, where if you're exempt, you don't have to take any further action, in New York, LLCs that believe to be exempt will have to make an initial filing to the Department of State seeking exemption and establishing it, and then subsequently on an annual basis, they'll be required to maintain that exemption. Next slide. Like I said, this subsidiary exemption is what is generally going to encompass LLCs. So it applies to entities whose ownership interests are controlled or wholly owned directly or indirectly by one or more entities that themselves qualify for certain exemptions under the CTA. Practically speaking, this means that nonprofit organizations who are generally qualifying for at least one of the CTA exemptions will also have their own subsidiary LLCs exempt, so long as those LLCs are wholly owned or controlled by the nonprofit organization. Next slide.
These are a few of the exemptions that are commonly applicable to nonprofits under the federal law. And then as Delaney just explained, which through the subsidiary exemption will then exempt their wholly owned LLCs from the New York law. So first, our tax exempt organizations. These are any organization described in section 501C of the Internal Revenue Code and exempt from federal income tax under section 501A. This includes organizations described in section 501c3, such as hospitals, healthcare organizations, schools, social services organizations, and other charitable organizations. It also includes 501c4 social welfare organizations, 501c6 business leagues or trade associations, 501c7 social clubs, and 501c13 cemeteries, to name a few. Next, political organizations defined in Code Section 527E and exempt from federal income tax under 527A are also exempt under the federal law. And additionally, split interest trusts such as charitable lead and remainder trust are exempt. And keep in mind that these are just 3 of the 23 available exemptions under the federal law. You'll want to make sure to review them all before you make a determination as to whether a subsidiary LLC is exempt from the New York law. Next slide, please.
We really want to focus on this idea that most LLCs which have a nonprofit or otherwise exempt parent are exempt themselves, because there are some situations which do create reporting requirements. So one example would be a mixed ownership joint venture. This would be an LLC which has multiple members. One might be a 501c3 organization and one might be a for-profit entity. In that circumstance, the LLC is not going to be exempt and will have to comply with the New York law. Another example is certain homeowners associations. So if you have an HOA exempt under 501c4 with a subsidiary LLC, that LLC would be exempt. However, if you have an HOA that's exempt under section 528 of the Internal Revenue Code, such as condominium management organizations, residential real estate management organizations, and timeshare associations, would not be considered exempt. Next slide.
Another situation which creates a reporting requirement is if the tax exempt parent of an LLC has its tax exempt status revoked. If this occurs, the LLC will have 180 days from the date of revocation to comply with the act. If the organization's tax exempt status is not reinstated within that 180-day period, which it's often the case, its subsidiary LLC will need to comply with the New York law's reporting requirements. Next slide, please. Okay, so as we touched on earlier, even an LLC that is exempt under the New York law has certain initial and ongoing filing requirements. An exempt LLC must first file an initial sworn statement of exemption attesting to the specific exemption claimed and the facts on which the exemption is based. The annual filings are also sworn statements confirming the LLC's exempt status. The Department of State will be releasing standard forms for these filings, and which will both be electronic. The deadlines for these filings depend on if the LLC is in existence on the effective date, which is January 1st, 2026. If the LLC is in existence before this date, the first report or exemption filing will be due on or before January 1st, 2027. Then if an LLC is formed after the effective date, its first report or exemption filing is due within 30 days of formation. Next slide, please.
So in terms of preparing for the state's law, and I think there's a question about, whether the state law has been stayed. There are several, I believe, injunctions against the Federal Corporate Transparency Act, and it's currently unclear how that's going to impact New York State's law. There's about 11 months of lead time here, so I'm sure a lot will happen in between then. But for right now, to prepare, if you are yourself, part of a board or an officer of a nonprofit, which, has subsidiaries, or maybe your nonprofit organization is part of a larger network of affiliated organizations working together, now's a good time to look at your org chart. See if there's any active LLCs that you believe would qualify for an exemption, which might need to file at the beginning of next year. Or maybe you have some inactive subsidiary LLCs, which you want to work on dissolving so that you don't have to deal with any reporting requirements going forward. Next slide. I think that's it. Thank you.
And I thank you both, Delaney and Emily, for that terrific presentation, and as well for answering questions that came in during your comments. If anyone wants to reach Delaney and Emily, their emails will be available to you in just a moment. So if Kathy, you could go to the next slide, please. Let me take this time just to remind everybody that, or actually to tell you, this is the first year learning of it, that our next webinar on Tuesday, the 11th, which will be at noon, as it normally is on the East Coast. It will be a special edition webinar. We've been trying to have more of these, as you know, and with the activity at the federal level, we thought this would be an important time to bring you some perspective on President Trump's executive order on diversity, equity, inclusion, and inclusion activities, and what that might mean for your organization. So it'll be from 12 to 12:30 a week from today. We will send out more formal notice about it later in the week, but please get the word out, and we hope that you will attend. If Kathy, you'll go to the next slide, please. Here's where you can find, thank you, the information on today's presenters. And if anybody has a question, email us. We want to hear from you. And in the interim, let me wish all of you a terrific balance of the week. A programming note, I won't be with you on the 18th because I will be traveling, but I will be available and hosting on the 25th. So I look forward to seeing you then. And in the meanwhile, you'll be in good hands with other hosts, and I wish all of you a terrific afternoon.